please give their attention to the opening statement of the prosecution. State.
Thank you. This case is quite simple. Pierce County Sheriff Ed Troyer got into a confrontation with a newspaper carrier and then lied to a 911 dispatcher by reporting that the newspaper carrier threatened to kill him. What Sheriff Troyer reported was a lie, and it triggered a massive emergency response. More than 40 officers began rushing toward his neighborhood in North Dakota, and 14 officers arrived at the scene. Sheriff Troyer took back what he said when interviewed by police. He said the newspaper carrier, Cedric Altimer, did not threaten him and did not show any weapons. It is against the law for any person to report a false emergency. It is also against the law to make a false or misleading statement to a public servant. The evidence will show that Sheriff Troyer did both of these things. The two questions you will have to answer at the end of this trial is, were Sheriff Troyer's statements to the 911 dispatcher false or misleading, and did he report a false emergency? Sheriff Troyer was sitting in his white Chevy Tahoe at 2:05 in the morning, parked in the middle of the street. He was blocks from his house when he called a 911 dispatcher from his cell phone. He said a man had threatened to kill him. Troyer, I'm at 27th and Deidre in Tacoma, North End, about 2 blocks from my house, and I caught someone in my driveway who just threatened to kill me, and I blocked him in, and he's here right now. Dispatcher, okay, go ahead with your address. Go again with your address. Troyer, but well, I'm at 27th and Deidre. Dispatcher, okay. Troyer, and he's in some sort of gray car, and he was in my driveway, in my neighbor's driveway, and he knows who I am, and he threatened to kill me. I got him blocked in at 27th and Deidre. Dispatcher Conrad Shadell entered the information into South Sound 911's computer system. Based on Sheriff Troyer's statements, Mr. Shadell believed Sheriff Troyer was in the middle of an active confrontation with a suspect who was threatening his life. He and other 911 dispatchers handled this as an officer needs help call. They began dispatching officers so they could get help to Troyer immediately. There are only 2 situations when the 911 system dispatches officers for a priority 0 call. One, when an officer reports that their life is at risk, and 2, if the mountain explodes. Our 911 system is set up to do everything possible to protect the life of an officer. The defendant in this case, Ed Troyer, had recently started his new job as sheriff when he made the phone call in the middle of the night on January 27th, 2021. Before that, he was the Sheriff Department's public information officer for 20 years. Prior to that, he was a deputy, patrol deputy. And because he was a law enforcement officer, and because he reported that a man had threatened to kill him, Sheriff Troyer became the highest priority in all of Pierce County. You will hear testimony from 911 employees and members of the law enforcement community about how they responded to Sheriff Troyer's lie. 911 dispatchers immediately sent Tacoma police officers and sheriff's deputies. Officers were speeding on city streets and highways with their emergency lights and sirens on, hoping they could get to the sheriff in time. Among the 14 law enforcement officers who arrived at Troyer's location were 3 sergeants and a police lieutenant. There were only 2 sheriff's deputies stationed in University Place at that time of night. Both deputies responded to the call and went to North Tacoma, leaving University Place without officers for 35 minutes. Sheriff Troyer stayed on the phone.
I'm sorry. Overruled.
Sheriff Troyer stayed on the phone with the 911 dispatcher for nearly 5 minutes while officers headed his way. You will hear a recording of that phone call. Other 911 dispatchers and officers in the field received updates every few seconds based on what Sheriff Troyer was telling Mr. Shadell. No weapons were seen, they were told, but the driver might be homeless. At one point, Sheriff Troyer said he tried to back up so the other driver could leave, but the man refused. Then he said the other driver wouldn't let him leave. At another point, the sheriff told Mr. Shadell that the driver was pushing against his car. A synopsis of these statements were communicated to officers while they rushed to the scene. Halfway through the call, Sheriff Troyer began describing what led to his call for help. He said he was home and saw a car entering driveways. Sheriff Troyer thought the driver was kind of a thief and might have a garage door opener, so he got in his Chevy Tahoe and began following the car. Sheriff Troyer said he tried to be polite to him, quote, but he just says I'm a racist and he wants to kill me, end quote. Tacoma police officers Chad Lawless and Corey Ventura were the first officers to arrive at 27th and Deidre Circle, a residential street in North Tacoma. They found Sheriff Troyer's white Chevy Tahoe sitting in the middle of the street facing a car. Mr. Altheimer, a newspaper carrier, was in the driver's seat. His car was also in the middle of the street facing Sheriff Troyer's vehicle. Officer Lawless was aware that nearly every available unit was coming their way. He observed that both Sheriff Troyer and Mr. Altheimer were physically separated and felt that he and his partner could conduct an investigation safely. He asked South Sound 911 to downgrade the call, the priority level of the call, so police units could stop rushing toward the scene. Officer Lawless and other officers approached Mr. Altheimer's car. Now remember, the only information they had at this point was the information from Sheriff Troyer going to the dispatcher. Based on the report that Mr. Altheimer had threatened to kill the sheriff, the officers approached Mr. Altheimer as though he might be armed and dangerous. They drew their guns out of their holsters. As officers surrounded his car, Mr. Altheimer's right hand was gripping the steering wheel, and his left arm was stretched out of the driver's open window. Mr. Altheimer was asked to get out of his car, which he did. Mr. Altheimer was asked to sit on the bumper of a police car, which he did. Then he was frisked for weapons. No weapons were found. More officers began arriving as Officer Ventura began asking questions. Mr. Altheimer didn't understand why so many officers were there. He was a newspaper carrier. Mr. Altheimer told officers that Sheriff Troyer had been following him. He had baby formula in the car, and he wanted to finish his newspaper route so he could return home. At least one officer noticed a pile of newspapers in the back seat of Mr. Altheimer's car. Mr. Altheimer has been a newspaper carrier since he was a teenager, and he has delivered newspapers in Sheriff Troyer's neighborhood for at least 3.5 years, 6 days a week. Mr. Altheimer works while most of us are asleep. He delivers the News Tribune, the New York Times, and other newspapers in the middle of the night because daily newspapers are not published and available for delivery until close to midnight. Mr. Altheimer will show you on a map where he first saw Sheriff Troyer. He was in his car turning onto North 23rd Street when he saw the white Chevy Tahoe turn onto Vista View Drive. They passed each other and went on their way. Mr. Altheimer didn't think much about it at first, but he will tell you that he became concerned when he saw the Chevy Tahoe again a little while later. He will testify that he had his headlights on and his windows down while driving from house to house. He put some newspapers in plastic tubes that are attached to mailboxes next to the curb. Other times he threw newspapers out the window and into the customer's yard, or he parked and got out of his car to walk the paper up to the porch. Mr. Altheimer saw the white Chevy Tahoe a third time. By this point, Mr. Altheimer was certain he was being followed, and he wanted to know why. He got out of his car and walked up to the driver. He asked Sheriff Troyer something to the effect of, "Why are you following me? Is it because I'm black? Are you a cop?" Sheriff Troyer did not answer any of these questions. He did not identify himself as a law enforcement officer. He did not show a badge, and he did not tell Mr. Altheimer that he lived in the neighborhood. Instead, he began questioning Mr. Altheimer. He asked whether Mr. Altheimer knew where he was and accused him of being a porch pirate. Mr. Altheimer suspected that the man he was talking to was a police officer, but since Sheriff Troyer didn't identify himself, Mr. Altheimer ended the conversation. He walked away. He had work to do. Mr. Altheimer got back in his car and tried to get away from the Chevy Tahoe. He continued his route and delivered to a couple more customers. But the Chevy Tahoe followed him again. Mr. Altheimer saw the Chevy Tahoe driving toward him, so he stopped. Now they were facing each other in the middle of the street, where Sheriff Troyer called a back-channel line at South Sound 911. This back-channel line is a phone number that officers can use to connect directly with a 911 dispatcher. Now, Mr. Altheimer has been stopped before by Tacoma police, many times. He's also been questioned by a couple of residents. He's used to people wondering why he drives on the wrong side of the street and pulls in and out of driveways in the middle of the night. It's not uncommon for newspaper carriers to get stopped because of the way they drive and crisscross streets, moving from house to house. But what Mr. Altheimer experienced on this night in late January 2021 went way beyond anything he had experienced before. Sheriff Troyer turned his own suspicions into something much bigger. His phone call caused officers to descend on the neighborhood and on Mr. Altheimer. Police officers quickly realized that Mr. Altheimer was in fact a newspaper carrier and did not pose a threat to anyone. But they spent the next 20 minutes detaining and questioning him. Sheriff Troyer remained several feet away near his Chevy Tahoe. Once police arrived, he moved away from Mr. Altheimer's car and parked. You will hear from Zachary Hobbs and other officers who went to the scene. Officer Hobbs was one of two police officers who talked with Sheriff Troyer. Officer Hobbs asked the sheriff what happened that brought officers to the scene. Sheriff Troyer told him that he was home, looked out, and saw Mr. Altheimer casing his house or his neighbor's house. Hearing no information from Sheriff Troyer about a threat or a weapon, Officer Hobbs walked over to Officer Chad Lawless and told him he should talk to the sheriff. Chad Lawless was the primary officer at the scene. He interviewed Sheriff Troyer after Officer Hobbs, and he wrote a report about this incident. Lawless, who has since been promoted to detective, will testify that he asked Sheriff Troyer twice whether Mr. Altheimer made any threats toward him. Sheriff Troyer said no. Mr. Altheimer never threatened him and never had a weapon, Sheriff Troyer said. He added that it was clear Mr. Altheimer wanted to fight. In effect, Sheriff Troyer backpedaled from his statements to the 911 dispatcher about Mr. Altheimer threatening to kill him. The statements that prompted more than 40 officers to rush towards his aid to him and caused Mr. Altheimer to be questioned as a possible suspect. By the end of this trial, we will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Sheriff Troyer made a false report about an emergency that did not exist, and he made a false or misleading statement to a public servant. Thank you.
Thank you. The jurors will please give their attention to the opening statement of the defense.
is simple, but it's huge to Sheriff Troyer. But it's also simple in terms of the defense. And what I want to start with here is this. This case is based upon the say-so of one witness. And that witness's conversations saying that there was statement by my client, our client, that there was no threat, was witnessed by somebody else. And that witness says, this is Officer Hobbs, that Sergeant, I keep demoting you, Sheriff Troyer, I've known him as a detective for a long time, over the years, said that he was threatened. So the whole case that you're here for, criminal case, 2 counts, 2 criminal counts brought by these prosecutors, is based upon this quote-unquote lie. That he said, initially I was threatened, and then he said later he didn't. Well, you know what? He didn't say that. He didn't say that. I want to take you back in terms of a few things that were just stated to you by the prosecutors in this case, that there were 40 officers and a massive response. False. Maybe 7 to 8 were there. That this was a call to 911. False. He called an inside channel that you might call to say, who's going to be on shift next? Are we covered enough? Internal kinds of communications. Saying that that there was a lie in this case by the sheriff. It's false. All false. We've talked about prosecutors that can go wrong, or prosecutions, that can go awry or not be well-intentioned. I submit to you that's this case. Sheriff Troyer has been with the department for 37, 38 years. He grew up, born and raised in Tacoma. He had a single mom, he had him at 17. He went to Wilson, and he went on to Tacoma Community College, Western Washington University, and was one of the youngest deputies in the sheriff's office at 22. He worked his way up in the department and became the PIO, which is the Public Information Officer that some of you recall seeing on the news. Because whether it was the Lakewood 4 that were killed, the officers sitting down having coffee that were shot to death, that was his job, to report the very tragic news to the citizens of this county and to follow up with any kind of information and assistance could be provided for the department. He was also the sheriff when Charlie and Braden Powell, Cox Powell, we say sometimes, were murdered by their father, Josh Powell, when they were in the care, custody, and control of CPS. He's worked with that family for many, many years, including their charitable groups, Charlie's Dinosaur, other charities, the Susan Cox Powell Foundation, and every year goes to the memorial at Woodbine Cemetery with the family to honor the memory of those children and many other children who have passed since those boys died. Tiles are there for them. He's been involved with Toys for Tots, he's been involved with Rotary, he's received numerous awards that he'll tell you about, but he's been dedicated to this county and its citizens. He's never had a sustained complaint for racism, racial profiling, harassment, use of force. We talked about that in jury selection too. When we look at credibility, character. What is somebody's character? How have they conducted themselves? Are they somebody of concern? This sheriff, Pierce County Sheriff, has a clean, amazing, laudable record. And he's been dedicated to the county and the citizens for his entire career. And yet he's here in a criminal courtroom, being charged in a case where the only witness they have to say that he lied, which he didn't, is contradicted by another witness, and there's evidence on a body cam, to contradict their claim of a lie. Ed Troyer has a family. He lives in the Vista View neighborhood, over by the Narrows, looking over the Narrows. He and his wife, Wendy, have raised a number of children that they treat as their own, have raised as their own, but they either fostered and adopted or fostered, many over the years. Wendy works at Charles Wright Academy. I bring this up because she gets up at 4 in the morning, and that's relevant to this case. She does the transportation coordination for Charles Wright for students. I think there's still one through the end of high school at Charles Wright, from other areas outside Steilacoom and Steilacoom too. And so she's up at 4, in this case, he was out at 2 when he looked out and saw Mr. Altheimer. So these times are important in terms of a few other things we're going to put in the case, and I'll talk to you about in a minute. The incident, again, so simple but so huge to him. I mean, it's his career, his life. It's criminal, the charges. So he was still dressed from work, jacket, kind of casual jacket, jeans. And the Vista View neighborhood, if you know it, is up kind of a hill. Looks down at the Narrows to the left and kind of over the bay. And his house sits on one of the streets closer toward the Narrows, and there's a hill behind the house. The top floor of his home is he and his wife's bedroom. And so as he noticed something suspicious out the window. His neighbors are down the hill across the street, and he saw a car without its lights on going in and out of driveways. And so that caught his eye. He's a sheriff. He's been a deputy. He looks at things to investigate, keep his neighborhood safe, and as a deputy, that's his job, to follow through and see if there's something looks suspicious, something else could be going on. Should I look into it? The answer is yes. That's how he works. That's what he's supposed to do, on duty or off. So he sees the car without the lights on. He gets into his car, and this driveway's kind of down this way from the window up here. He comes around, doesn't see the car again, and this is not going around a whole neighborhood. This is a matter of a handful of blocks that this happens in, literally about 3. So he comes up the hill, and this is Sheriff Troyer, and he turns and sees to a side street the car that he had seen before going in and out of driveways. And as he came into the side street, he encountered Cedric Altheimer. And Cedric Altheimer was mad. He came and confronted Sheriff Troyer at Sheriff Troyer's car. And he started yelling at the sheriff. Now, mind you, he said later, Cedric Altheimer said that he knew who this was. And we also know he knew where the sheriff lived because he had put a paper behind his house before or after. There were 2 incidents of going to his house. But he had said that he knew he was a police officer, and an indication he knew this was the sheriff. When he went over to Sheriff Troyer's window of his car and started yelling at him, and he said this, "I'll take you out." Now, you'll hear in this case, and Sheriff Troyer is going to testify and tell you all of this, everything that happened. "I'll take you out." Sheriff Troyer took that to mean a death threat. But somebody else did too, in terms of that phrase, and that was President Biden, when he talked about killing a terrorist. And he went in a press conference and said, if you basically mess with the United States as a terrorist, we will take you out just like we took out that terrorist. And we killed him. "I'll take you out." He took that as a threat, and he said so. Now, again, he didn't call 911. He didn't call for a massive response. He called a backline that has a nickname with initials. I won't use them here, but it's kind of a funny joke they have because it's kind of minor, silly, whatever, but housekeeping matters. Not calling 911, not calling dispatch saying, "Someone threatened to kill me, get 40 officers here." So he says simply this, "I got a guy here, I need some help to get him calmed down." That's what Sheriff Troyer said. That's it. Cedric Altheimer turned around in his car to face Sergeant Troyer and essentially block him in. And that's where they sat until there was assistance. Altheimer apparently was filming, things like that, and he was very, very angry. And he was angry when the officers got there. Now, I want to be specific on this in terms of exactly what was said at the scene. I'm going to need my glasses for that, so forgive me. I can't quite see you when I'm looking at this, but okay, it's this. So Chad Lawless, he's expected to testify. Well, he has to make this, to even bring this case. and he's with the Tacoma Police, not Pierce County. He basically indicated that he had a conversation with Sheriff Troyer at the scene. And he said he talked about a threat. Now, what Sheriff Troyer remembers is that, as the timeline goes, at some point, Sheriff Troyer learned that Cedric Altheimer was a paper carrier. And it was like, oh, that's why he's going in and out of driveways. That's why he's here at 2 in the morning. Sorry, it looks suspicious, but okay. So what Sheriff Troyer remembers about the conversation was an ask of, do you want to do anything else? Do you want to follow up? Should there be something else done? Are you okay? And it's kind of like no good deed goes unpunished, because Sheriff Troyer said, no, don't write it up. He threatened to kill the sheriff. But did the sheriff say have him charged? No. Did the sheriff say let's write a report? No. Did the sheriff say arrest him? No. He said, he's a paper carrier, now I get it. And that was the conversation. So you have Lawless, who didn't take a report at the time, who didn't take contemporaneous notes, didn't memorialize this conversation in any way, saying something different than what the sheriff says. Doesn't it make more sense that what the sheriff said what would have happened, which is, okay, let's all disperse, he can go, it's all fine, as opposed to, he threatened to take me out, he threatened to kill me, and then to come back and say, oh, I guess he didn't say that. Because that's what the state's case is. That's what the state's case is, which is he retracted a statement. He didn't. Simple misunderstanding, miscommunication, but there's more. Because Officer Lawless didn't have his body cam on, like you're supposed to. Now, admittedly, that was earlier on with these, but still, there was not a requirement at the time, but they were available. Policy dictates you wear them. We hear about that all the time in the news. Body cam protects the officer, and it protects, suspects. But he didn't have it on. Other officers did, but he didn't. He wrote a report later, but not at that time. And the other thing you'll hear from witnesses in this case is he had text messages about this case and about this encounter that he erased. But there's a couple that remain, and they're important for your consideration. In the text messages exchanges he had about the sheriff and about this incident, these are not my words, these are the words in the text. The references to the sheriff are things like this. He's a bitch and a douchebag. Excuse me, but that is the language. No body cam, no notes, misunderstanding or misinterpretation in a conversation, and animus. That's their only witness to bring a criminal case against the sheriff of Pierce County. So, at the scene, there was basically an investigation. This was not 40 officers, like I said. These are not guns drawn all over. That's completely false in the state's case. False. What happened afterwards? It was over. No jail, no investigation further, no nothing for Cedric Altheimer. It was over. So he was allowed to leave, but he came back and went back behind Sheriff Troyer's house. You ask yourself, how did he know where Sheriff Troyer lived? How did he know he was the sheriff? He knew all along. Went back behind his house, which is up a hill, and it has kind of a side entrance that Sheriff Troyer had for one of their children, Foster, and the kids they adopted that was in a wheelchair. So it was kind of a path that they made wider back behind the house. Mr. Altheimer went back behind the house and pitched a newspaper. He'd also been seen yelling in front of the house. So this isn't a case of he said, he said. It's a case where all of the evidence The substantial evidence supports Sheriff Troyer. All of it. And it's also not a case of racial profiling. The state will tell you they're not alleging that in this case. They've already gone on record saying this is not a case of racial profiling.
Objection, misrepresents.
I think that's what we
Overruled.
said. Thank you, Your
Overruled.
Honor. That this is not a case of racial profiling. The case, the criminal case, is not the only case that Mr. Alzheimer's brought or participated in against the sheriff. He's filed a lawsuit for $5 million. $5 million against the sheriff, county, city. And I'm bringing that up to you because it's relevant to his credibility when he takes the stand, and he will take the stand. Anybody that has a financial interest in a case, whether it's $5 million, more or less, has a financial bias to win, an interest to win, so to speak, in the criminal case. And I submit to you that's a very important factor in this case against Sheriff Troyer and on the believability of Mr. Alzheimer. The burden of proof we talked about during the course of our jury selection. I know it was long, but I appreciate all of your candor and your attention. It's so important. I mean, the opening statement is important, the evidence is important, but the jury service and selection we thank you for, and we'll try to keep you with as brief a time as possible and hopefully no snow. But we talked about the burden of proof in that, and the state has the burden of proof in this case. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt on this evidence the sheriff of your county is guilty of a crime of false reporting. False reporting to 911, to the dispatcher, to the inside line, and false reporting to create an emergency. They have to prove that he willingly lied. That's what the jury instruction is going to be to you, that he willingly lied about getting a threat. How could they ever prove that? Because that claim is false. Absolutely false. Their case, I'd submit to you, is one where they looked at certain parts of the case with more of kind of one look that was optimistic, but ignored the true facts of the case, and that's what you're here for. There's no corroborating evidence for what they have to say at all. The corroborative evidence is on our side, and it's important and true. You'll hear from other officers that were there at the scene. One will be Officer Ventura, who I think is going to testify tomorrow morning, and to talk about, what was seen at the, I hope I'm not getting sick, but I don't think I am. I'll stand back a little bit. But you're going to hear from the other officers at the scene that talked about, at the time, and they will now, about that Alzheimer was very upset, very angry, there were profanities, things like that. The touching of him or pat downs, called like a Terry kind of a stop, was really just his front pockets. Just make sure, that's what officers do. But what officers do, and especially the sheriff does, is to make sure that there's suspicious activity afoot, that they at least look into it. And when you live in a neighborhood where your neighbor's the sheriff, I'd submit to you, you probably think maybe the sheriff will look out for our house too. Just like we look out for all of our neighbors. He looked out for them well over the years and did at 2 in the morning on the date of the incident. He supervises over 300 Pierce County deputies. He's got all the corrections staff, hundreds supervisors. He's in charge of a lot, but he's sitting in a courtroom, charged with 2 crimes. It's travesty, and it's a tragedy. And on behalf of him and our team, you've met them before, Nick Gross, my co-counsel, and the sheriff, and Katrina Martin. We want to thank you for your attention and hope you listen carefully to the evidence, but more importantly, to the lack of evidence. And we know that the evidence will permit you, and it will lead you, and it will ultimately compel you to return verdicts on both counts of not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. And members of the jury, a couple of things. We're going to release you here shortly so you can go home and get a good night's sleep for tomorrow. When you return to the jury room here. So, and that's correct, I think, from staff. So no more going down to 135. You'll just come back up here. There's an elevator that's dedicated to only this floor. So, and you'll see that downstairs when you get to the second floor. And so you'll advise who you are, and then you'll be taken by the elevator up to here, and then you'll just go into the jury room, and you'll see how to get out and into that one after you're released today.